The language of the inscription is Sumerian. Sumerian is the oldest written language. It's not related to any of the Indo-European or Semitic languages in that part of the world.
A team at Harvard tested Sumerian DNA against every population database on Earth, 400 civilizations compared, and the results were 0 matches. Their genetics have no ancestors. Their language has no relatives. The world's first civilization was genetically isolated from the rest of the world. But when I tracked down the research, the story grew stranger. One study found continuity. Another suggested that DNA rarely survives in the Mesopotamian heat. The data is published. The full explanation isn't. What really happened when scientists compared Sumerian DNA to every major ancient civilization? And why are the results so shocking? The viral claim that broke the internet. The video dropped on May 8, 2026, and within just 2 weeks, it had pulled in more than 500,000 views. What made people stop scrolling wasn't a dramatic thumbnail or a celebrity endorsement. It was a claim so specific, so confident, and so strange that it immediately sounded like something the world should already be talking about. According to the video, Harvard researchers had taken ancient Sumerian DNA and compared it against 400 population databases from around the world. The result, it claimed, was astonishing. Not a few distant relatives, not weak genetic connections buried deep in the data, absolutely none. The video insisted there were 0 matches. Then, it pushed the story even further. According to the narrator, a second laboratory independently verified the findings and reached the same conclusion. The implication was impossible to miss. If the claim were true, the people who built one of humanity's earliest known civilizations somehow had no detectable connection to any modern population on Earth. That would not be a small correction to history. The fallout would be enormous. Researchers have spent decades building a picture of how ancient populations moved, mixed, and evolved across thousands of years. A finding like this wouldn't just add another piece to the puzzle. It would make people question whether part of the puzzle had been understood correctly in the first place. Part of the video's appeal came from the fact that it wasn't built entirely on fiction. It started with genuinely intriguing details. One of them involves the Sumerian language itself. Despite more than a century of study, linguists still haven't been able to firmly connect it to any known language family, which is why it's often described as a language isolate. That's a real mystery, and it's exactly the kind of detail that makes viewers more willing to follow the story wherever it goes next. It also referenced ancient Sumerian stories involving the Anunnaki, powerful beings that appear throughout Mesopotamian mythology and have long fueled speculative theories about humanity's origins. Those details are real enough to create a sense of credibility before the video arrives at its central claim about genetics. And that's where things become interesting. The narrator repeatedly stated that the data had been published and that the results were available for anyone willing to look. Yet throughout the presentation, there was no research paper title, no journal name, no laboratory report, no lead researcher, and no direct link to the supposed study. Viewers were given an enormous conclusion, but almost none of the information needed to verify it independently. Think about that for a second. When you see someone confidently say, "The data is published," but they never tell you where to find it, what do you think happens? Most people assume someone else has already checked. After all, the claim sounds academic. It mentions databases, laboratories, and researchers. The language feels scientific. Yet the more closely you look, the stranger the situation becomes. A story containing incredibly precise details somehow arrives without the most basic requirement of scientific credibility: a source. And that may be the first real mystery here. Millions of people heard the claim, shared it, debated it, and argued about what it meant. But almost nobody stopped to ask where the research actually was. If the data's published, where is it? The only real study and what it actually found. The search ended at a single paper, After digging through academic databases, journal archives, and every lead that seemed remotely connected to the viral claim, one study kept appearing over and over again. Published in 2011 through the National Institutes of Health and titled "In Search of the Genetic Footprints of Sumerians," it sounded like exactly what we'd been looking for. Except it wasn't. The title creates one expectation. The actual study tells a very different story. According to the researchers behind the paper, their goal wasn't to prove that the Sumerians were some mysterious population disconnected from the rest of humanity. They were trying to understand whether traces of ancient Mesopotamian ancestry might still be present among the marsh Arabs. This community has lived for centuries in the wetlands of southern Iraq, the same general region where the Sumerian civilization once flourished. What they found was not isolation. According to the study, Y chromosome data suggested continuity between the marsh Arabs and older populations from southern Mesopotamia. In plain English, the researchers found evidence pointing to genetic connections over time, not their absence. The paper was exploring links, ancestry, and population history. It was not reporting a genetic dead end. That immediately created a problem. The viral video claimed that researchers had compared ancient Sumerian DNA against hundreds of databases and found 0 matches. The NIH study was discussing continuity with ancient Mesopotamian populations. Both stories referenced the Sumerians. Both used scientific language, yet they appeared to be describing completely different realities. So, where was the second study? The video specifically pointed viewers to what it described as a 2019 Harvard project involving ancient remains from the Royal Cemetery of Ur. That sounds precise enough that finding the research should have been straightforward: a university name, a year, a famous archaeological site. Normally, that's more than enough information to locate a published paper. Instead, the trail started going cold. What did appear in 2019 was reporting on archaeological work at Ur. According to Smithsonian Magazine's coverage of the excavation, researchers were continuing to study one of the most important Sumerian sites ever discovered. There were archaeologists, artifacts, excavation updates, and new analysis of ancient remains. What there wasn't, at least in publicly available reporting and academic records, was a published DNA study that matched the extraordinary claim from the viral video. And that's where the contradiction became impossible to ignore. One peer-reviewed study, available to anyone, suggested continuity with ancient Mesopotamian populations. The viral claim described genetic isolation so complete that no modern population could be connected to the Sumerians at all. Both cannot be describing the same evidence. Here's the thing. Scientific disagreements happen all the time. Researchers constantly challenge one another's conclusions. But when two studies seem to say opposite things, the first question isn't which one sounds more exciting. The first question is whether both studies actually exist. If you came across two scientific claims that completely contradicted each other, what would you check first? Because before deciding who's right, there's a bigger issue we need to understand. Ancient DNA research in Mesopotamia faces challenges that most people never hear about, and those challenges may explain why finding reliable genetic evidence is far harder than the viral video makes it sound. So why is DNA testing in this region so difficult in the first place? Why Sumerian DNA testing is nearly impossible? Here's the problem. Nobody really talks about when these viral DNA claims start flying around. Ancient DNA from Mesopotamia almost never survives in a usable state, not in a way you can actually run clean comparisons on. Heat, humidity, and time don't just damage DNA, they erase it. And once you understand that, the whole idea of large-scale testing starts to look very different. According to a 2024 review in the Journal of Archaeological Science discussing ancient DNA preservation limits, warm and humid environments accelerate molecular breakdown so aggressively that genetic material often fragments beyond recognition within centuries rather than millennia. In other words, the exact conditions that define southern Iraq, the heartland of ancient Sumer, are basically the worst possible environment for DNA survival. Think about that for a second. This is the region where one of humanity's earliest civilizations rose, yet the climate itself works against preserving the biological evidence of those people. That's why you see such a strange imbalance in ancient DNA research. According to multiple archaeological genetic studies, including work summarized in the field of ancient DNA research, regions like Egypt and parts of Europe yield far more recoverable genetic material, often because dry deserts or cold conditions slow degradation. Mesopotamia, by contrast, sits in a zone where moisture and heat combine almost like a constant biological eraser. Now here's where it gets interesting. A 2019 Smithsonian Magazine report on excavations at the Royal Cemetery of Ur describes how archaeologists continue to uncover artifacts, burial structures, and cultural remains from one of the most important Sumerian sites ever discovered. But even in those detailed reports, there is no confirmed, large-scale, published DNA dataset from Ur itself. The archaeology is rich. The genetics side is still extremely limited. That gap matters, because when viral content claims that scientists ran ancient Sumerian DNA through hundreds of modern databases, it assumes something very important: that high-quality ancient DNA from Sumerian remains is widely available in the first place. But researchers working in this field have repeatedly pointed out the opposite problem. According to Dr. Ripan Halder, a forensic anthropologist at the University of Waterloo who has published extensively on DNA degradation in extreme environments, genetic material recovered from hot climates often survives only in fragmented form and rarely remains intact enough for large-scale population matching without heavy uncertainty. The result is not a clean data set. It's scattered fragments that require cautious interpretation. And that brings us back to modern populations in Iraq. Genetic studies of present-day groups show patterns of partial continuity with ancient Mesopotamian ancestry, but also significant mixing over thousands of years through events such as Persian expansions, Islamic-era population movements, and later Mongol incursions. Real-world genetics in this region is layered rather than cleanly separated. So when a video confidently says 0 matches, it's skipping over a much messier scientific reality. The real challenge isn't just running comparisons, it's whether you even have enough intact ancient DNA to make those comparisons meaningful in the first place. If DNA from Mesopotamia barely survives long enough to study properly, how exactly would any study produce the kind of definitive results the viral claim is describing? And if the data is this fragile, what does that mean for everything people think they know about testing ancient Sumerian ancestry? Genetic extinction is real but complex. Genetic extinction is real, but it doesn't look like what most viral stories try to sell you. The moment populations disappear from history, something interesting happens in genetics. They don't just vanish cleanly from the human record like a switch being turned off. What actually happens is messier, slower, and honestly more difficult to explain in a viral video. You get mixing. You get a replacement. You get faint signals that survive inside later populations, even when the original group no longer exists as a distinct identity. And that changes everything about how you interpret a claim like 0 matches. According to a 2020 study published in Nature Genetics examining ancient DNA from the Minoans and Etruscans, both civilizations show what researchers describe as genetic extinction at the population level. But here's the twist: their genetic signatures didn't completely disappear. Instead, they survived in low levels within surrounding modern populations, meaning traces of their ancestry still exist today, even though the original populations are no longer distinct groups. Now here's where it gets interesting. A similar pattern appears in research on the Indus Valley Civilization, often associated with ancient Harappan populations. Genetic studies referenced in population history reviews show that while the original civilization structure collapsed, fragments of their ancestry persist in modern South Asian populations, alongside later migrations. It's not a clean break. It's layers built on top of layers over thousands of years. So when you look at modern populations in Iraq and the surrounding regions, the expectation from genetics is not total absence. According to a 2023 review in Nature examining ancient Mesopotamian population structure, the region shows evidence of continuity alongside repeated waves of migration, including movements from Anatolian farming groups, Iranian plateau populations, and later historical expansions. What you see is accumulation, not erasure. Think about that for a second. Even in cases where populations change dramatically over time, the biological record doesn't reset to zero. It blends, it fragments, it leaves echoes that can still be detected if you know what you're looking for. Dr. David Reich, a population geneticist at Harvard Medical School who has led major ancient DNA research projects across Eurasia, has repeatedly described Near Eastern population history as deeply layered, shaped by continuous interaction rather than isolated genetic islands. In that kind of system, a complete absence of genetic connection would be unusual, not expected. So when a viral claim suggests zero matches between ancient Sumerians and modern populations, it runs into a problem that isn't just about data availability. It clashes with how population genetics actually works in real human history. Here's the question that starts to form when you line everything up. If genetic extinction leaves behind faint traces almost by definition, then what would it even mean for a population to show absolutely no matches at all? Because that isn't how human populations behave over time. Not in the Mesopotamian region, not anywhere else studied at this scale. Mixing is the rule, not the exception. But if science keeps describing continuity and admixture, why does the viral narrative insist on total separation? And what happens when the story shifts from complexity to certainty? The mystery still unfolds. The DNA test results are still sitting in this strange, unresolved space where certainty and doubt are pulling in opposite directions. On one side, there's a peer-reviewed study from 2011 published by the National Institutes of Health, examining marsh Arab populations in southern Iraq and finding Y chromosome continuity with ancient Mesopotamian ancestry, according to the paper archived in PubMed Central, PMC 3215667. On the other side, there's a viral claim spreading through millions of views that says Harvard researchers tested genetic data from ancient Sumerians against 400 modern populations and found zero matches. Yet no published paper, dataset, or verifiable authorship is ever provided to back it up. And both of these stories are circulating at the same time. Now here's where it gets interesting. Modern genetic studies of Iraqi populations consistently show a layered ancestry pattern, with traces of ancient Mesopotamian genetic signals appearing alongside later migrations and population shifts over thousands of years, as documented in the population genetics literature, which tracks how the region was shaped by continuous movement rather than isolation. That doesn't point to clean separation. It points to overlap. But the viral narrative doesn't work in layers. It compresses everything into a single idea. Zero matches, no ancestors, total disconnect. And that simplicity is exactly what makes it spread so quickly, especially when it's paired with elements people already find fascinating. Ancient Sumerian mythology involving the Anunnaki, often interpreted in popular culture as sky beings described in Mesopotamian texts, adds a layer of mystery. The fact that the Sumerian language is considered a language isolate in linguistics, meaning it has no confirmed living language relatives, adds another. Then the genetics angle enters, suggesting complete biological separation from modern humans, even though that specific claim is not supported by published peer-reviewed research. Think about how powerful that combination is when it's packaged into a single video. You've got ancient mystery, linguistic isolation, and supposed genetic proof all pointing in the same direction. Even if each piece is incomplete on its own, together they create a story that feels unified and final. But real science rarely moves like that. According to the NIH Marsh Arab study, what researchers actually observe in this region is not disappearance, but partial continuity shaped by centuries of interaction, migration, and genetic mixing. And according to broader population genetics research on the Near East, including work published in major journals tracking ancient DNA across Eurasia, the genetic history of the region is better described as overlapping layers rather than isolated branches that end cleanly, so the tension becomes obvious. One version of the story is simple and absolute but lacks verifiable publication details. The other is complex, fragmented, and grounded in documented yet less viral research. And the question that refuses to go away is why the simpler version is the one that reached 500,000 views in just a couple of weeks, while the peer-reviewed study that actually exists remains largely unknown outside academic circles. Is it sampling differences between datasets, limitations in ancient DNA preservation, how incomplete the current record remains for Mesopotamian genetics? Or is it something else entirely about how people interpret scientific uncertainty when it's packaged into a compelling narrative? The data we do have is published, that much is clear, but the full explanation, the one that connects these conflicting claims into a single, coherent picture, still hasn't been fully laid out in a way the public can easily see. And that leaves one final question hanging in the air, the one that matters most beyond Sumer itself. When different sources confidently tell different versions of the same scientific story, how do you decide which one actually reflects the truth? Outro. One study points toward continuity. Another viral claim insists on zero matches. Modern populations in Iraq still carry traces of ancient Mesopotamian ancestry, even as centuries of migration have layered new genetic signals atop the old. And the uncomfortable truth beneath all of this is simple. DNA from hot climates rarely survives in clean, complete form, which means every conclusion we draw is built on fragments, not a full record. So when the answers don't line up, the real question isn't just which one is right, it's what we're still missing from the picture. What do you think is driving these conflicting stories about Sumerian DNA?